By now. Welcome to One Place. It is good to be here this morning and to continue our journey together into studying the Word of God. This fall at Andrews University, as you know, we are going through the books of the Wisdom of Solomon, two of them. We've already spent four anxious, exciting weeks, whatever we call them, into the Song of Solomon. And now we're going into a very different book from the Song of Solomon. We're doing Ecclesiastes. We started Ecclesiastes last week. Today we're doing chapter 2. So here we are in this very different book. Just as much as Solomon reveled, celebrated love and pleasures in Song of Solomon, now he is much advanced in years. In fact, he's near the end of his life. And Solomon has a very different interest and tone when he writes the book Ecclesiastes. This is not a book about pleasure. It's not a book about enjoyment. It's not a book about the effervescence of youth and the joy of sexuality. Far from it. It's all gone. It's all past. He's got something else to think about. It's a very different approach to life, very different perspective on life that we find in the book Ecclesiastes. Many people consider that the book Ecclesiastes was written from a very pessimistic and very cynical way of understanding life. For some people, it's depressing, it's doom and gloom. Life is futile, life is senseless. In fact, this little phrase here, all is vanity, coming from a Hebrew word, hebol, kind of means something like meaningless, futile, useless, pointless. There's no real good English word to translate that Hebrew word. We're trying to understand what it says, but all the connotations are a little similar, a little vague. In any case, Solomon looks at life now from a very different angle than when we looked at the Song of Solomon a couple of weeks ago. We know of Solomon from two other books of the Bible, 1 Kings and then 2 Chronicles. And we find in these two books that Solomon is a great king, that he's inherited the kingdom of Israel that his father David gave him, and that's a blessing from God. And Solomon becomes a great king, and even greater than his father David was. He does alliances with the surrounding kingdoms, and out of that, he grows into a wide extent. People from all over the known world want to come and talk to him. He becomes a wise king and also a rich king, a very rich king. But somehow, sadly, as we will see, things happen in his life. Amidst the fame, the wealth, the wisdom, for some reason, he becomes very self-centered. Complete different perspective on life. In a famous and very sad move, he rejects the God of Israel who gave him all of this, who blessed him so abundantly with wisdom, fame, riches. And he begins to serve the gods of Egypt and the gods of Canaan. He turned away from Yahweh to worship the gods of other nations. In the first few chapters of 1 Kings, which I would invite you to turn to before we get to Ecclesiastes here today, 1 Kings 10 and 11. In the first chapters of Kings, we see Solomon building a beautiful temple to God, one of the marvels of the world, of the ancient world. He built his own palace, which becomes also an attraction. We hear about his armies, his wealth, his chariots, his horses, the alliances that he made with the surrounding nations. In chapter 10, 1 Kings chapter 10, we read about his splendor, what kind of a king he becomes. And look at these two verses, 14 and 15. Chapter 10, 14 and 15. The weight of the gold that Solomon received yearly was 666 talents, not including the revenues from the merchants and the traders, and from all the Arabian kings and governors of the territories. 666 talents. Now, some of you have probably footnotes and margin notes. How much weight is 666 talents? 25 tons of gold a year. I have never seen with my eyes, I have never touched with my fingers one of those bullions of gold. You know these bricks of gold that you see in movies sometimes? I don't know, how much does that weigh? 10, 15, 20 pounds? They seem to be heavy. Anyway, I have never seen one. Solomon gets 25 tons of gold a year. Somebody calculated during first service and told me at the end, you know how much money that is? That is very, very close at the price of gold today to $1 billion in gold that he gets every year. That's an awful lot of money today. In those days, that was 1,000,000 times more money than it is to us. It's just to tell you about the riches, the wealth that this man becomes. Verses 23 to 25, also in chapter 10, tells us a little bit more about Solomon. King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom of God had put in his heart. Year after year, everyone who came brought a gift, articles of silver and gold, robes, weapons, spices, and horses and mules. Can you imagine? Can you imagine all the wealth that comes to him? Now, there's one thing that comes through in 1 Kings, in those first 10 chapters, and it is that all that Solomon gets, the wisdom, the fame, the gold, the wealth, all comes because of a blessing coming from God. God gives it to him. God gives him the wisdom, and people want to hear about the wisdom, and when they come, they bring gifts to him, and that makes him even richer. That's one thing. The real reason for Solomon to be that kind of a king is because of God, because God blessed him more than anybody had been blessed before. But unfortunately, as we know, the story takes a bad twist. 1 Kings 11, the next chapter, tells us that Solomon's relationship with the other kingdoms around him, the alliances that he made it so that he married many, many princesses from these kings so that the alliances could be solidified. We're told that one of them is the daughter of the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh of Egypt. And we're told also from 1 Kings 11 that he ends up with a harem. Now listen, he ends up with a harem of 700 wives and 300 concubines. You know how many partners that is? I mean, we already know from the book Song of Solomon that he's attracted to women. But that many? Yep, that's it. And God's judgment happens because he builds temples to these women. Many temples in Jerusalem are dedicated to these pagan gods. And then he begins to worship their gods with his wives. And he abandons God. All of this wealth, all of this wisdom, all of this fame is given to him by God, Yahweh. He gives it all up, kind of, by worshiping all these foreign gods. And so God's judgment comes along. Later in chapter 11, starting in verse 9, God's judgment is given to him because of what has happened. It is a severe judgment. In fact, I think it's brutal. Here's what it says. 1 Kings 11, verse 9. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who appeared to him twice at the very beginning of his reign. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow the other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, now here we don't quite know if it is through a third vision or maybe a prophet came and told this to Solomon. But in any case, the Lord speaks to Solomon now a third time. Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe, for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. Yes, God's judgment is most severe. I would say it's even brutal. Basically, God says, I gave you all of this. Well, I'm taking it all back. And I'm going to give it to somebody else. Not to you, not to your sons, not to your family. Most commentators believe that after receiving this judgment from God, this decision from God, Solomon is shaken up terribly. He repents, changes his life, abandons these cults and these pagan worships, goes back to God, and it is out of that repentance that he writes Ecclesiastes. That's how it happens. That's how we have today Ecclesiastes. It is the book of his legacy to us. At the end of his life, Solomon is a sad man. A man who, because of his selfish behavior, idolatrous lifestyle, will lose everything he has. All of it. He had been given so much by God's grace. Now he feels empty. He feels lost. He feels his life is meaningless and futile. All because God has decided he will not be able to pass it on to his son. And now he sees that life in general is meaningless. He is a depressed man with little left to live for. And that's Ecclesiastes. So this book is about what happens to a famous, rich, wise man who, after years of folly, stupidity, and sinful behavior, comes back to his senses. From that angle, it's a very sobering book, extremely sobering for anyone who's in the same predicament, for anyone who's contemplating or engaged in the same folly, wasting time, wasting fame, wisdom, and riches. The end result is the same, according to Solomon. It's all vanity, it's all meaningless, and it's all futile. That's what life ends up being. So our chapter today is chapter 2, Ecclesiastes chapter 2, and it is Solomon's reflection. I think it's a little hard to interpret, these various passages of Ecclesiastes and try to understand the angle they come from. Here's how I think things are happening in chapter 2. Solomon is reflecting on his legacy. What is he going to pass on to others? And the difficult lessons he has learned from that experience with God, away from God, and back to God. And part of what deceived Solomon, I think here, is that when he began to worship these gods, particularly the Egyptian gods, he began to believe that everything he acquired in this life, he would take it away in death. He would take it with him. Well, see, that's the pharaohs. That's what the pharaohs believed. You've seen probably documentaries on tombs of the pharaohs, on these Egyptian pyramids and Tutankhamun and so on. They've got these ornate tombs with multi-chambers. The king is buried in a beautiful sarcophagus at the very end, and then in between the door, between himself and the door, many, many chambers filled with what? With gold, with jewelry, with chariots, with food, with wine, with anything, furniture, gold furniture, that the king could use in his afterlife. It almost sounds that that's the way Solomon begins to think, that everything God gave him, he's going to keep it. He's going to take it away from him in death. And then what he can't have with him in death, he's going to pass it on to his son. And when he dies, he's going to take it away with him in death. So it's always going to stay in the family. They're going to keep all that wealth. It almost sounds that this is what's happening here in chapter 2. That all of this fame, all of it, it's for him. But as we read 1 Kings chapter 11, God has had other plans in mind. No, that's not the purpose. That's not the reason why all of this was given to you. All this fame, riches. No, not at all. In fact, because of your behavior, somebody else is going to benefit from it. And so here we are. First section of chapter 2 takes on the appearance of a dialogue. He talks to himself. He's having a monologue with himself, but it really happened. Solomon is reflecting back upon his life of pleasures and how it deceived him. For years he thought that pleasures of life would provide him with what is most meaningful in life, satisfaction. No, not at all. Little did he know that God did not have that in mind for his wealth. And so without realizing it, I think he drifted away from God. He entered a life of selfishness, and nothing could give him satisfaction. Chapter 2, verse 1. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Well, laughter, I said, is madness, and what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. So he experiments, he tells us. He's drifting away. He experiments. And he experiments with alcohol, drinking parties, folly a little bit, amusements, pleasures. Is that going to be meaningful in life? He comes to the conclusion, no, not really. There's not much pleasure in any of that. When you sober up, you realize that there's no pleasure there. And so he continues his reflection. Verse 4, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. Verse 5, I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves that were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasures of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed for me. Verse 10, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. Chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun. What a sobering reading. It's full of selfishness. Have you counted how many times the pronoun I is used in these 11 verses? In my NIV here, I counted the pronoun I 18 times. This is the gospel of selfishness, of self-centeredness. It's the gospel of me, myself, and I. We did all of this. All of it, we acquired it. He says nothing about how he acquired this wealth, how he was able to live this life of pleasures. He says nothing about the social impact that this kind of a lifestyle had upon his own people who believed he was blessed by God, who were willing to sacrifice months and weeks of their lives to build these temples, to build these palaces, to build these horse stalls and farms and vineyards and so on. He says nothing about what people sacrificed for him. But worse, he says nothing about God. All of it was given to him by God. God said at the very beginning of his kingdom, what do you want me to do for you? And he prayed for wisdom. And God said, all right, I'll give you wisdom, but I'll give you a whole lot more on top of this. It's all from God. All he had is from God. And here in this poor me pity type of a passage, it's all about him. It's all about him. He reflects back on his life, and it's all about him. Total failure. That's what it becomes, a total failure. Because God is forgotten from this internal dialogue. And God has a very different idea of what to do. Finally, Solomon comes to his senses. He repents of his lifestyle after he reflects on God's last conversation and judgment. After years of futility, in pleasures, self-centered pleasures. Finally, he realizes that all that he has done will benefit someone else, not him and not his son, not his family. And so at the end of the chapter, or a little bit more toward the middle, he says three things that are worth noticing. Verse 15. Three things that are worth noticing here when he comes to his senses. Then I said to myself, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain from being wise? He acted as a fool, a stupid man who forgot who gave him all of his blessings. Lesson number one, remember who blesses you. Number two, I said to myself, this is meaningless. For the wise, like the fool, will not be long remembered. The days have already come when both have been forgotten. Like the fool, the wise must also die. Solomon had been deceived to think that everybody would remember him, that he would have one of those beautiful tombs like the kings of Egypt, and beautiful designs, paintings on the walls, wealth, everything. Everybody would remember him for ages and ages and ages. And now he comes to the realization, no, a fool is not remembered, so nobody will remember me. We're grateful that God led him to write this book, because that is his legacy. That is why we remember him, because of this book. But at the moment, he realized, no, people don't remember fools. Third lesson. So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me, all of its meaninglessness, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. Yeah? It's not going to go to his son or his grandson. It is going to go to one of his servants. One of his servants, after he is dead, is going to start a revolt, and he and his tribes are going to take more than half of the kingdom of Israel. And his son, Rehoboam, will keep very little of it. And because of his stupidity also, will lose a great deal of things. Well, we say perhaps quietly in our hearts, well, isn't that what you deserve? God had blessed you. God had done so much for you. God had given you so much wisdom and fame in all of this, and you squandered it out of selfishness. You begin to think that it's all about you, and you don't realize the abuse that you've done to other people. So self-centeredness. God's judgment on you, that's just fine. That's what you deserve. Take it. Eat it. Perhaps some will say that maybe we're a little harsh on Solomon. After all, God placed him there as the king of Israel. After all, we got to be careful here. Soft pedal on one of God's anointed. Yeah, sure. After all, Solomon was selected by God to become king, to become the son of Solomon, the son of David, who would be, the king of Israel. Now, that's all true too. But I think we're forgetting something. We're forgetting about the context of grace and God's mercy that is in all that story. A lot of grace and a lot of mercy. You see, Solomon is not only the son of David, he's the son of Bathsheba. And here's how the story goes. And it's not a nice story. It's an awful story. It's a poignant story that just tears you apart. You see, Bathsheba, that's Solomon's mother. One day she is raped by David, and she becomes pregnant. And to hide what he just did and the pregnancy, David makes it so that her husband is going to be killed. And so now he forces her to marry him so that he can hide the pregnancy as his child. And, well, there's this prophet that comes along, and everybody talks about it and points out things the way they are. And finally, David comes to his senses that this is really, really awful, what he just did. What he did to himself, to his family, but what he did to this woman and her family. David repents. It's the beautiful chapter, Psalm 51 in the scriptures. David repents, And God says, okay, we'll wipe things clean, but I have a condition. It is one of her sons who is going to become your successor on the throne of Israel, because she has suffered also a great deal at your hands, and he will be the king after you. David agrees, no problem. Is Solomon forgetting all of that? Is Solomon forgetting the grace that has been extended to his father, but also to his mother? And his mother is so proud that her son is now the king of Israel. This story is bathed, is framed in grace and mercy. This king is king because God loves his people, because God intervenes and he comes and he does things different in our lives, that God comes and changes us from the inside out. And when everything is messed up, and you can't mess up anything more than what David had messed up here. This is awful. Well, God comes in and somehow helps, supports, heals, and makes things better. Solomon forgets all of that, begins to worship somebody else than the God who gave him all of that. That's the end of the story. That's what's happening here to Solomon in this chapter, in this entire book. That's the context, a context of grace, a context of love that it seems Solomon has forgotten all about. In the end, when he writes the book of Ecclesiastes, that is what Solomon finds to be futile and meaningless, that he has lived a life away from God, and that all that he did in the end, it will all disappear. What heritage is he going to leave to his sons, to his son, to his kingdom? Nothing. God will take it all away because of his stupidity and sinfulness. Everything is vanity. Everything is meaningless and futile. Over time, what becomes a heritage and a legacy is not what we acquire, you know. I'm trying to think about what this means to me. What we have done to others, you know, how have we lived our lives? For most of us, the great majority of us, we're not going to leave riches untold to our successors. No. What are we going to leave for others? Trying to think at the end of this chapter what it says to me. 2 more verses, verses 24 and 25 at the end of chapter 2. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat and find enjoyment? That's right. Without God, there's nobody. Without God, there's nothing. That's the lesson that I find here at the end of this chapter. The book of Ecclesiastes from Solomon is a reflection on life and what gives value to life, but also what takes value out of life and makes it meaningless and useless and futile. If Solomon is so pessimistic and cynical about life in this book, it's because he made his life that way. He is reaping the consequences of his action. He was given a great kingdom by his father David. He was loved and blessed by God. He received wisdom from God to become a generous and a wise king. In the end, it's all taken away. All the pleasures he sought for himself and he went after now are utterly meaninglessness to him. Everything is like the wind. It's passing, it's fleeting, it's transient. Wow. Well, I want to learn something from this chapter. I don't know about you, but I want to learn something, and I want to learn it before it's too late in my life. I want to realize that I need to set my priorities straight in my life. I need to be careful about how I value things and people, and who counts most, and who's most important, and what value do I give, you know, to what I do, yes, my profession, but the people around me. I want to think straight about my priorities. I can't forget what gives meaning to life. I don't want to. There's more to life than material things, than fun, than pleasures. And that's a hard lesson to learn. And I think that's the lesson that Solomon learned here. So I wonder about my legacy. What will I leave? I know I'm not going to take anything to the grave with me, sure. But what will I leave as my legacy? And I wonder, what will you leave as your legacy?